This is the biggest Subaru available in North America. It's the 2023 Ascent. It's fresh out of the plastic surgeon's office after having recently received a bit of a nose job up front, but the changes are more than skin deep versus the last time we took a look at this model. We have new tech on the inside, including bigger infotainment systems that are standard and the latest Subaru driver assistance software. But Subaru has not changed the value pricing proposition of the Ascent. This is still one of the least expensive all-wheel drive entries in this segment, and it doesn't go nearly as high as a lot of the competition. You're going to be paying around $35,000 for the base model, and no version of the Ascent goes over $50,000, of course, before that pesky sales tax charge. If you think the Ascent looks like a supersized Outback, I would say you're not exactly wrong. They certainly subscribe to the same design philosophy as many of the German luxury brands, essentially same sausage, different lengths. But if you look a little bit closer, you'll notice that this grille, even though it looks a lot like what's going on in the Outback, the Crosstrek, the Legacy, etc., it's not exactly the same. Subaru does subtly change it across the lineup. We don't have that multi-module grille that fades over to the side like we do find in the new Impreza and the Crosstrek. However, we have the distinctive Subaru logo there, the chrome bar that runs through there that we find in a decent number of Subaru models, and very similar headlights and fog lights. These headlights are steering headlights standard in every trim. That's an interesting twist. For $35,000, including destination, you get some of the best headlights in this segment, including all of the optional headlights in models that will sticker up to about $60,000. Subaru really has a strong headlight game going on, and if you live out in the middle of nowhere like I do, that's certainly one reason to take a look at some of their models. We get LED fog lights down there at the bottom. You'll find those on the upper level trims, and you'll certainly notice that we have a very tall front end. It's not all engine, because this uses the same boxer engines that we find in the rest of the Subaru lineup, so the engine's really kind of down there. But if you look closer at the grille, you'll notice something interesting. This upper section right here is actually a different grille intake. That's for the top-mounted intercooler on top of the engine. Subaru does not use a front-mounted intercooler on the bottom like you find in some turbocharged vehicles. It's on top, sort of old-school style, and then they duct the air in through here rather than a hood scoop on top, which I kind of think would have looked interesting. Very old Subaru, definitely, to have a hood scoop. The exact reason that Subaru chose a top-mounted rather than front-mounted intercooler is locked away in Subaru's secret vault, but if you are concerned about rock chips, etc., getting in your intercooler and perhaps damaging it, or minor fender benders or mild off-roading damaging it, then it's going to be a little bit safer on the top of the engine. Of course, you could end up damaging the engine radiator and 6 of one, half dozen the other. You're still going to be stuck. Subaru also puts their active safety sensors up here behind the windshield. It uses a 3-camera setup rather than a radar sensor up front. So if you want to change the front end, I have actually seen Subaru Ascents with rally lights on the front. If you want to do that sort of thing, or put a brush guard or whatever on the front, it's not going to affect the functionality of the adaptive cruise control or the autonomous braking system. From the side, the Ascent certainly looks like the Outback until you get closer, and then you realize how much bigger it really is, especially the roof height. So many of Subaru's popular models, I think, are popular because they're very practical with a really low roof height to help you get stuff on top, but clearly that couldn't work with a 3-row crossover. So this is about as high as a Highlander, maybe a little bit shorter than a Pilot in terms of its roof height. At 196.8 inches long, it's also right between the Pilot and Highlander in terms of its overall length, almost exactly the size of the Kia Telluride, which has been very popular in the US. But unlike the Telluride, we have this long hood profile up front. You'll notice how much longer the hood is than some of those shorter hood options. And that does mean that on the inside, we don't get nearly as much room as you find in the Kia and the Hyundai Twins. If you want something a little bit bigger and roomier, of course, you should be taking a look at the new Grand Highlander or the Chevy Traverse for 2024. They are notably larger than the Ascent. But if you want 3 rows of Labrador carrying, then this is certainly the way to go. The family resemblance continues out back, where we find partial LED taillight modules, LED brake lights, and LED parking lights, but incandescent turn signals and backup lights. It's worth noting that even though the LED steering headlights are standard up front, the turn signals up front are incandescent as well. The rear end design certainly looks like the Outback wagon, but down here we have even more plastic cladding, because nothing says rugged 3-row SUV like having more body cladding than a Star Wars convention. Subaru separates the cladding in 3 separate pieces, so you can remove this center section if you want to install a hitch on your Ascent and tow up to 5,000 pounds. It is kind of a handy twist that if you scuff one of these up, you could also replace one of these independently of the other because they're not body colored. Down here at the bottom, we get standard dual exhaust tips. Subaru has also updated the active safety and driver assistance tech on the Ascent. This has their latest version of EyeSight. That's their 3-camera setup that provides adaptive cruise control, lane centering, lane departure warning, etc. We also have available blind spot monitoring and rear cross traffic detection. You'll actually find that on every Ascent except for the base trim. If you get the rear parking sensors, you get reverse auto brake as well. That's optional on one of the trims, standard on 7 of them, not available on the base trim. If you get the top 2 trims, which would be Onyx or the Touring trim we're looking at now, we also have a 360-degree camera system, which has a little camera right here just below the Subaru logo, cameras on the side view mirrors, and of course the one in the back. The only thing Subaru spends more time advertising than Labradoodle puppies and standard all-wheel drive is their decision to use Boxer engines in everything. Subaru is by far the biggest producer of Boxers in the world. In a vehicle like the BRZ, it has the effect of allowing it to have an extraordinarily low hood profile because the engines are very, very short vertically. In the Ascent, with this big boxy front end, it has the effect of you opening the hood and wondering, where did the engine go? And the answer is, it's way, way down there. The cylinders are actually right about here in the vehicle, just below the entire grille module. These upper intakes right here connect to this scoop that feeds that top-mounted air intercooler that I mentioned earlier. It's an air-to-air intercooler, and all of that plumbing and the intake stuff, etc., is all completely on top of the engine. This 2.4-liter turbo is standard, and it produces 260 horsepower, 277 pound-feet of torque. It's logically related to the one that we find in the WRX, but Subaru says it's not exactly the same engine. It's mated to standard all-wheel drive, of course, and a standard continuously variable automatic transmission. Your fuel economy will range between 21 miles per gallon in the top trims like this one and 22 miles per gallon if you get the models with 18-inch wheels and tires. That's pretty similar to the Telluride and Pilot, but it's worth noting that the new 2.4-liter turbo in the Highlander will actually get you 24 miles per gallon combined and an 8-speed automatic transmission. And if you want a hybrid, the Highlander hybrid will get you 34 to 35 miles per gallon. It's not going to be as capable in terms of its all-wheel drive system as this, but it's going to give you considerably better fuel economy. If you don't need all the space, there are a few other hybrid options out there, but clearly the Highlander and the Grand Highlander are the most direct competitors. Bearing in mind that this is the most expensive version of the Ascent, I'm going to give these seats 10 out of 10 points. We have 4-way adjustable lumbar, the driver's seat gets an extendable thigh cushion, which is a touch that I really appreciate, and we have a manual tilt telescopic steering column with a large range of motion. There's a 2-position seat memory setting right over there on the driver's door. Most versions of the Ascent will have a power driver's seat. It's really just the base model that doesn't get it. The top-end versions will also have a power passenger seat, but it doesn't offer the same range of motion as the driver's seat. No version will get adjustable lumbar support. They also don't get the extending thigh cushion. I don't think that's much of a problem, however, because keep in mind this does not go over $50,000. And if you take a look at some of the competition that will give you an identical passenger seat, they're going to be thousands of dollars more than this. Jumping into the second row, I have plenty of room if this seat is all the way back in its tracks. The front seat's adjusted for me at 6 feet tall. Headroom is a little bit lower than some of the competition, especially if you choose this large panoramic moonroof. It is going to drop headroom down a little bit further than some of the options with pano moonroofs. That may have to do with the way that Subaru has chosen to put the air vents up here in the ceiling rather than in the center console. This does have 3-zone automatic climate control with controls back here for the 3rd zone, also controls to the heated seats, an AC outlet, and USB charge ports as well. Getting in and out of the vehicle is pretty easy because we have a very low sill for the second row. You can get this as either a 7 or an 8 passenger vehicle. You can get captain's chairs in the middle or a bench in most trims, but the top end trim is going to be captain's chairs only. Subaru gives us a few nice touches here with the captain's chairs. There's a bit of a grab handle right here to help you get in and out of the 3rd row. That's a nice touch, although this aisleway is a little bit tight because the Ascent is not quite as wide as something like the Volkswagen Atlas, not quite as square either. We have fold-down armrests for these seats. You should know that these do not articulate in a way that would let you leave a child seat latch anchored into place over there on the driver's side or over here on the passenger side. If that's a feature of interest to you, then you may want to look elsewhere. On the other hand, the Ascent is one of the few options that gives us 3 sets of latch anchors for the middle row, also 1 additional latch anchor back there in the 3rd row. The The cup holder situation is a little bit unusual. We have bottle holders in the doors. I know a lot of folks that actually put cups in there. That can be a bit dangerous because kids are probably going to slam that door with the cup in there, and then you're going to have milkshake all over the seats. We then have 2 additional cup holders that flop out of the center console, but they're in a position that makes me worry a little bit that kids might just kick that right off the car. Let me know what you think in the comment section. Getting in and out of the third row is fairly easy, whether you want to walk through the middle or just tilt and slide those seats forward. It's also pretty easy to pop that third row into place if it wasn't already in place before. Closing the door, that is a bit of a stretch. Let's go ahead and put this seat all the way back in its tracks and see what's going on. Ooh, you can see things are definitely a little tight on the legroom front. These third row seats also have a bit of recline, so don't worry about the recline functionality. They're not quite as upright as it would seem. You can actually move that one back there as well. But legroom is definitely on the constricted side. This third row is approximately the size of the third row in the Highlander. Until someone in the back decides to sit a bit more upright or put their head back there to the headrest, you'll notice there's a lot less headroom back here in the third row than you'll find in some of the larger options. Actually, a little bit less than you'll find in the Highlander as well. Like the Highlander and the Pilot, the third row is relatively tight if you do plan on using the third seat, and that's just the way that it is in vehicles that are this dimension on the outside. We have hard armrests with cup holders for the third row passengers, and the center seat positions belt does come out of the ceiling. That is not exactly my favorite location, but I do appreciate the fact that you can get this as a 7 or an 8 passenger vehicle. That is pretty handy. Although I think I would have preferred a 2-passenger third row and a 3-person bench in the middle. Here's a closer look at those latch anchors in the third row. You should know that if you choose to use those, they can interfere with that center seatbelt position just because of the width of this bench in the back. Let's start our interior tour back here. You can see those air vents in the ceiling for the third row, the furthest extent of that large panoramic sunroof, just over the second row passengers' laps, and of course the well-integrated sunshades into the back doors as well. Subaru uses pretty similar materials front and rear. We have soft touch materials in the upper section of the door, imitation wood trim there. There's the bottle holder I mentioned earlier. We also have a really soft touch armrest on all 4 doors, and you can see there's additional storage down there at the bottom. Logically, the sunroof controls are up here on the ceiling. We then have incandescent reading lights. I think that's a bit of a bummer, but again, keep in mind the pricing. Controls for the integrated telematics system, and then this is a combination sunglass holder and rear passenger monitor mirror right there. The sun visors are the extendable variety, which is a nice touch. We then find height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, and 4-way adjustable ratchet style headrests. The bolstering on the front seats is not terribly aggressive, so larger drivers and passengers shouldn't have too much of a problem there. Since this is the top end trim, these are Nappa leather seats that are both heated and ventilated. That's part of why we have the perforations right there in that seat bottom cushion that you can see. Moving over to the front doors, again, similar materials to what was going on back there. We have soft touch plastics on the upper section, really soft armrests, that imitation wood trim that I kind of like. Let me know what you think about that. There's definitely an old school vibe going on with this cabin, but I kind of dig it. Down there we have bottle holders well integrated into the front doors as well. And the rest of the dashboard also has kind of an old school vibe to it as far as the shapes and just the general construction here. We have a handy slot right here where you can store things like smartphones for passengers, things like that. And it is soft touch on the inside as well. That stitching actually continues on the inside. It's not a separate rubbery area right there. Below this, we have a decently sized glove compartment. I was barely able to squeak an 11-inch tablet computer inside, and the entire dashboard is a soft touch material, both the upper and lower sections right there. Now, you should know that if you don't get this absolutely top-end trim, then you will not get any more speakers than the base trim. Interestingly, only the very top 2 trims, Onyx and Limited, get the 14-speaker approximately Harman Kardon audio system. Everything else gets a base 6-speaker system. This little module right up here is part of the driver attention monitoring system. We then have a center channel speaker, and then the big change is that every version of the Ascent gets this big LCD infotainment system that has been moving across the entire Subaru lineup, really. Basically everything in their lineup gets this particular screen now. It has a combination of physical buttons over on each side, and then lots of touch controls down there on the bottom for the climate control system. Moving down from there, we have a decently sized storage area where you could put your smartphone, also some USB input ports right there, auxiliary input, which is kind of a nice touch, and then even more of that imitation wood trim. Again, let me know what you think of that. I really don't mind it at all. In fact, I kind of started to like it over this week that I've had the car. It is unusual that there's not a lot of shiny black plastic in here, other than obviously right around that infotainment screen right there. So if you're not a fan of back plastic, you might want to take a look at this. We have a somewhat gated shifter down here, drive all the way down there, manual mode over to that side, electric parking brake, those big cup holders. Between the front seats, we have a really thickly padded center armrest and a fairly deep storage area. I was able to squeak a gallon of milk inside. Even in this top-end trim, we have a mostly analog instrument cluster. Of course, there is a small color multifunction display in the middle of everything, but at this price point, a number of the competition will have a full LCD cluster. Keep in mind, the Ascent doesn't get as expensive as some of the competitors, but when we're approaching $50,000, you will find bigger LCDs and heads-up displays in some of the options. The 3-spoke steering wheel should be familiar if you've spent any time in a recent Subaru product. We have controls for the infotainment system over here, volume up, down, track forward, backward. On the back of the steering wheel, we have paddle shifters down on the left and up on the right. You can see it's leather wrapped and it has some sport grips there. On the right side of the steering wheel, we have controls for the adaptive cruise control system, the aggressive lane centering software, and then just behind there, there is another little button for the heated steering wheel function. To the driver's left, again, we get more of that imitation wood trim. Let me know what you think about that. I definitely prefer this to the shiny black plastic we find in a lot of the competitors. You'll find the controls for the seat memory over there, and then another little storage cubby just to the left of the steering wheel. That is a handy place to put your smartphone, I think, as a driver, especially since this does support smartphone integration wireless. So right now, my iPhone is not actually connected. It's actually hanging out over there in that other compartment. Before we get this out on the road, we should talk wheels and tires. 18-inch wheels are standard. These are the optional 20-inch wheels, and you do get a little bit less rubber cushion with these. These are 50 series tires, but the width is constant, 245 millimeters all the way around. Some folks have complained that the Ascent is a little bit heavier than average for the segment, but remember that at 4,221 pounds starting, all-wheel drive is standard, and most of the competition, actually really almost all of the competition, starts as a two-wheel drive vehicle. Four-wheel drive is optional, so something like a Honda Pilot will end up heavier than this in its top-end trims. This tops out just under 4,600 pounds. It's now time to get the Ascent out on the road, so of course we have to talk about acceleration first. You'll notice that this CVT will always imitate shifted gears, so a little bit different than we find, for instance, in the Subaru Crosstrek, where from a stop it will just vary those ratios rather than giving you those imitation shifts. I suspect if this transmission operated the same way as the Crosstrek and a number of the other options, it would be faster 0 to 60, but as it is, 7 seconds even is what I measured here. And that was pretty repeatable. I know that a few outlets have said that they got faster 0 to 60 times if they manually shifted the vehicle. I didn't see any difference at all there. If you leave it in the shifted gear selection and it automatically shifts, or if you do it with the paddles, it doesn't seem to make the vehicle go any quicker. But 7 seconds is still pretty solid. I suspect they probably could have shaved 1 or 2 tenths of a second off the time though, if they had just let this CVT be a CVT. And to be honest, these paddles aren't going to fool anybody. Anybody that knows anything about transmissions and has driven a regular automatic transmission vehicle with paddles is going to tell that something is a little bit different under the hood in this vehicle. That said, I still like the paddles on the back of the steering wheel because it definitely helps keep this vehicle at the speed you intend when you're going downhill. Definitely important for some of those rougher gravel trails, etc. In my 60 to 0 stopping test, it took this model 123 feet to stop from 60 to 0, which is pretty middle of the pack. And that best describes really the driving dynamics of this, as long as we're including some of the larger vehicles in the segment. This is a little bit more dynamic than the average minivan, but it's not going to be as much fun to drive out on your favorite winding mountain road as the Honda Pilot with its torque vectoring rear axle in the back, or something like the Telluride and Palisade. This does feel notably softer, especially when you start pushing it in the corners. There's definitely a lot more body roll, especially if you start waggling the steering wheel around. You'll definitely notice the body rolling. There's a lot of dive if you push on the brakes. There's a reasonable amount of tip if you step on the accelerator pedal. So the suspension is certainly tuned towards the more comfortable side of things. I could see some folks maybe getting a little bit car sick in the back as a result, but honestly, that also happens in the firmly sprung options because of the amount of bouncing you're getting back there, and that's not happening in the Ascent. This is a much smoother tune to the suspension. So if you're looking for something that's more comfortable, not quite as focused on sharp handling, you definitely want to take a look at this. Subaru does spend a lot of time marketing all-wheel drive and low center of gravity, etc. That logically factors in somewhere to the way that this behaves, but it's not the defining characteristic of the Ascent. You don't get behind the wheel and think, wow, this has a low center of gravity, it's really going to carve the corners. that's not what the three-row Subaru is about. Ride quality is excellent out on a rougher road surface in this, and that's why I give it an A+ when it comes to the ride quality. There are a few factors here. Remember that the Subaru Ascent has more ground clearance than a lot of the competition, so over bumps like that, speed bumps, potholes, etc., there's simply more motion available for the suspension to travel up and down because of the ride height and the general design of the suspension system in the vehicle. We also get tires that are not quite as low profile as you'll find in some competitors. Obviously, these are the lowest profile available, and they're still 50 series tires. Decent number of the competition have moved to 40 or 45 series tires for their top-end models, and you will definitely notice a difference when it comes to the ride quality, especially with freeway expansion joints, those larger imperfections, or if you do want to take your entire family and their tent and everything else, your roof tent, whatever, out to the national park, and you're going down gravel roads that are worse than this for hours at a time, you're going to want something like the Ascent. The all-wheel drive system in here is not as capable as a Grand Cherokee or Grand Cherokee L with the 2-speed transfer case, the true locking differentials, etc. But for that kind of road surface, you don't need any of that. But you do need a suspension that is more compliant and more designed for that kind of duty than you'll find in a Highlander or a Pilot, etc. And the Pilot is an interesting twist because, of course, we have the new Trail Sport version of the Pilot, but the Trail Sport still has a very firm suspension. The result is that the Pilot is just not going to be as comfortable as the Subaru if we're talking about road tripping, whether that road tripping includes highway with expansion joints and potholes, or it includes rougher roads like at a national park. Back out on the paved road, we measured 71 decibels at 50 miles an hour, putting this sort of in the thick of things when it comes to its cabin noise figure. You will find slightly quieter options in the segment, especially some of the quiet V6 options. Now, this engine, it's a little bit gruffer than some because, of course, the 4-cylinder boxer design, but Subaru has spent more time isolating this boxer from the cabin than we find in the turbocharged Outback. So if you have an Outback, something a little bit quieter, you might want to take a look at this. If you're after the best engine sounds in this segment, there are a few naturally aspirated V6 engines left, but they're getting few and far between. Turbos are actually the way this entire segment is going. The Highlander no longer has a V6 available. We aren't going to find one in the new Traverse or the Acadia, and it's only a matter of time until the rest of the competition follows them right down the turbocharged rabbit hole. There are certainly pros and cons to the turbo engine. We have gobs of torque, and this is definitely torquier feeling, especially at lower RPMs than you'll find out of the naturally aspirated V6 competition. But the fuel economy, unusually actually for Subaru here, is a little bit below what I had expected. I've been averaging 19.8 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving. That is a reasonable miss off of the 21 mile per gallon EPA average for this car. Highway fuel economy generally seems to be fairly good, but even in steady state highway travel, I was not able to average about 25 miles per gallon. I think that's where the loss was coming. Things seem to go down there towards 23 or 24 mpg. You will notice that the new Highlander, with its 2.4 liter turbo and 8-speed automatic transmission, is more efficient than this, and in steady state highway travel, actually the Telluride and Palisade are a bit more efficient as well, thanks to their Atkinson cycle engines. I have to say that if you don't have the benefit of fuel economy, then I don't see the reason to have the CVT in this model. I generally don't mind CVTs, especially in smaller, less powerful vehicles, but by the time you've worked your way up to this power level, especially nearly 300 pound-feet of torque, and you're in a vehicle this big with plans to tow, etc., towing up to 5,000 pounds is available in this, then I think we should just have a stepped automatic transmission. And I would love to see what Subaru could do in some of their larger vehicles, or maybe their more performance-focused vehicles with, say, an Aisin or a ZF 8-speed automatic transmission. The drivetrain layout in modern Subarus is actually quite similar to a modern Audi. The transmission is right there next to me underneath the vehicle. The engine is entirely in front of the axle, and the all-wheel drive system and front differential are just jammed inside a rear-wheel drive transmission case. Now, rear-wheel drive, quote-unquote, due to its layout, but as with most modern Subarus, this is going to send most of its power to the front axle for most driving conditions. It has a clutch pack that can connect and send up to 50% of power to the rear, assuming no wheel slip up front, and then more power can go to the rear, of course, when there's wheel slip. But this is never going to have a rear power bias like Subarus used to in previous days. It's all about fuel economy, and that's why we have this particular design. Again, if you want something more capable, if you want rear-wheel drive, you could look at the Grand Cherokee L, but it's going to be a lot more expensive than this. It's actually practically going to be Subaru Ascent plus Subaru Crosstrek in terms of its pricing. As I said at the beginning of the video, Subaru has priced the Ascent pretty aggressively. Honestly, like most of the Subaru lineup. It starts at $35,490, and that does get you a fairly well-equipped Ascent. But there are a few things you should keep in mind. That base trim is going to have a relatively limited color palette. It's also going to have a lower tow rating than the rest of the lineup. It seems that they have removed some of the extra cooling features from the vehicle that gets you up to 5,000 pounds. So just 2,000 pounds in that base model. Also, you'll get a manual driver's seat and a urethane steering wheel. I kind of find urethane steering wheels a little bit yucky. They kind of stick to your hands in the summer. You definitely want the wrapped steering wheel. You also don't get the keyless entry system and the push button start. You still get a remote, but you don't get the ability to just grab the handle and open up the vehicle. The last major omission is the fact that we don't have blind spot monitoring or rear cross traffic detection in that base model, and those are features that I really think should be standard on every new car. I kind of wish Subaru had bumped the base price up a little bit and just included that particular feature and, left out all the rest. The other thing that some folks might be interested in or not is that the second row climate controls have been removed in the base trim. Now, weird twist. 3-zone climate control is still there. It's just that the controls for the third zone in the back are not there. I think that's actually not a bad thing to trade off because you really just want the air vents back there and the ability to control the climate separately. And I kind of like the fact that that is just in charge of the driver and the front passengers. That way the kids don't have any buttons to press. Of course, in the vehicles with the controls in the back, they can be locked out, but I don't think it's a bad thing to just delete those controls and save a bit of cash. In addition to a low sticker price, the other thing Subaru has been doing really well lately is deciding exactly which features to put in which trim and really keeping those trim levels very neat and tidy. You'll notice there wasn't a lot of price differential between the trims, and that's because you basically just choose your trim and you choose your color, and that's it. There are really very few options, as we find in the rest of the Subaru lineup. Also, like a lot of Subarus, we get the standard turbo, we get the standard all-wheel drive. Well, standard all-wheel drive, the turbos aren't standard in most Subarus, but we do get a lot of ground clearance and excellent ride quality. Definitely a strong Subaru value right there as well. And in this trim, I kind of dig the wood trim. I know not everybody is a fan of it, but I kind of think it works there, and I would rather have the faux wood trim than the glossy black plastic we find in so many. Now, on the downside, the Ascent is not as roomy as you might think. In some critical dimensions, it is actually closer to a Kia Sorento than a Toyota Highlander. We actually get a little bit more third-row headroom in a Kia Sorento and about the same kind of legroom. The only area where the interior of the Ascent is larger than the smallest Kia 3-row crossover is the width of the cabin. So you do find a bit more width across the third row, which is why you find a third seatbelt back there. And the second row and first row are also just a little bit wider. But importantly, if you're looking for a roomy 3-row crossover, you want to look for some of the larger options like the Telluride, the Palisade, the Grand Highlander, and of course the upcoming Chevy Traverse. Also, if you want a more tech-laden cabin, you might want to look elsewhere because even though we do get that big screen in the dashboard, we don't get the full LCD cluster you will find elsewhere, and the software on that big LCD is starting to feel a little old. Also, no hybrid model, and lastly, the Ascent is pretty difficult to find, probably because it's such a good deal. If you want an Ascent, you probably have to ring around to all of your Subaru dealers, possibly even pre-order one. You have to be prepared to hunt for a while, and you may even need to be prepared to pay over MSRP. And that means that this competitive pricing chart might be a little bit tricky because some of these vehicles may be selling above and some may be selling below MSRP, but we'll just dive right into the MSRP. As you can see, the Ascent is not only thousands of dollars less than the mainline competitors, it's thousands more or less when you consider the fact that it has all-wheel drive standard, and the red dots are the front-wheel drive or rear-wheel drive models. The white dots are the all-wheel drive trims. So in order to get all-wheel drive in your Highlander, it's going to be significantly more expensive than the Ascent. It is going to be just ever so slightly larger in certain dimensions, especially the third row. If you're looking for more legroom, you'll need to step up to the Grand Highlander because the Highlander actually has less legroom than the Ascent. Also a little bit less cargo room depending on exactly where you're looking. Now, on the other hand, the Grand Highlander and the Highlander offer a hybrid system, something that's not available on the Ascent. And you'll actually get two different hybrid systems on the Grand Highlander, just the one on the regular Highlander, getting over 35 miles per gallon in the real world. The Ford Explorer, it's a reasonable deal. It also is a little bit sportier, and there's an off-roady version. There's also a twin-turbo V6 version if you want to go crazy, but it's going to cost you significantly more in those top-end versions. And really, on average, notably more than the Ascent. But the Explorer is pretty roomy on the inside, and I do like the combination of on-road driving dynamics. The mild off-roading versions that they do offer in the lineup are also interesting, and I really like the option to get extra power. Speaking of extra power, we do have the 2023 Honda Pilot, which has probably the best automatic transmission of this bunch. It's Honda's 10-speed automatic, shared with a number of other Honda and Acura models. The V6 engine is also standard, and it's the only one in this group to give you a torque vectoring rear axle. Now, on the downside for the Pilot is not as roomy as it once was. Or perhaps to be more specific, it's not as much roomier versus the competition as it once was. Yes, it does have an important 3 inches more third row headroom than the Ascent, and that's going to be a big deal for a lot of shoppers, but the cargo area, it's basically the same size. The number of seats, pretty darn similar, although you can get more seats in the top end version because Honda still gives you the option to have a bench in the middle of the Pilot. It does have the torque vectoring all-wheel drive system. It does have an off-roady version, but I would rather off-road in the Ascent, even though it doesn't have a factory skid plate like the Honda does. And that's because the suspension tune in the Honda is just not well suited for actual off-road use. You can do it, and it does have all the hardware to do so, and it's really well equipped to do so. It's just that the suspension is pretty firm, it's more on-road tuned, it's not going to be as pleasant on those longer journeys. The fourth bestseller in this segment is the Kia Telluride, the option that came out of nowhere just a few years ago, and lately it is either the third or the fourth best-selling depending on the month you're looking at. It's really giving the Pilot a run for its money, and it's easy to see why. The Telluride is solidly good-looking, it has a nice V6 standard, a reasonable 8-speed automatic transmission, not quite as engaging as the Pilot's, but definitely a solid transmission, more engaging than the CVT we find in the Ascent. And more importantly than most of that, it is huge inside. It has tons of legroom, front row, second row, and third row. It has a decent amount of headroom in the third row and a pretty big cargo area as well. It has one of the largest cargo areas in this segment at just over 20 cubic feet. All of that combined with the reasonable all-wheel drive system and now a ton of different options to choose from is exactly why the Telluride has been selling so well. Now, on the downside for the Telluride, if you want the top-end trims, you're stuck with black wheels, but if you like black wheels, that's probably going to be fine. Other than that, markups on the Telluride have been absolutely insane thanks to its popularity. Kia really did not expect this vehicle to sell as well as it does, and they've had struggles keeping up with production and keeping up with dealers that just want to mark things all the way through the roof. So depending on the month you're talking about, a Telluride might be selling at MSRP, it could be a few $1,000s more, and the Ascent, even though Subaru can't really keep up with it, it seems that their dealers are not putting as much markup on the hood, so it might be a little easier to find an Ascent closer to its MSRP. Bottom line, the Ascent is a fantastic deal. There are a few flaws. The fuel economy, I think, is a flaw. Not the biggest fan of the CVT in a vehicle this large, especially if you want to tow, but its off-roady, adventurous nature is definitely there. The standard turbo is there, and it's just going to be really easy for families that don't need the third row on a regular basis. If you're regularly using the third row, choose one of the larger options. That would be the Kia, the Hyundai, the Chevy, the upcoming Buick refresh. We should be seeing that soon, the Grand Highlander, etc. In a pinch, the Honda Pilot. The Pilot's third row is not as generously sized as it once was. The other options are going to be a little bit more comfortable. But if the third row is more of an occasional use third row, or it's simply being reserved for smaller kids where you put the adults and the bigger people in the second row, the Ascent is going to be a very solid value. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. And are you looking at an Ascent? If you are, what are you cross-shopping it against? Are you cross-shopping against this list, or perhaps some of the more off-roady oriented options like a Grand Cherokee L, which is going to be significantly more expensive than any of the options we've talked about so far? Let me know. See all of you later.